In this video, we're going to talk about a second really important technique, which I call pre-masking. And this allows us to refine our masks so that we get the best selection possible. So we can combine pre-masking and matching to come out with a really good final result. Now, what exactly is pre-masking? Well, sometimes when we're trying to create our mask, we don't always get the selection that we want. If you remember in the last video, when we created a mask around, let's say, Brights 2 here, we still had this information in the window, and we want that to be white. We don't want it to be visible. Now, in this example, we could actually just bring along the highlight slider, and that removed much of the exterior. But that doesn't always work well with certain images. And there'll be times, especially when you've got clouds in the sky and things like that, where you find it really impossible to make the sky white or light gray. Remember, it doesn't have to be white, the area you're trying to select. It can be light gray, and when we're luminosity masking, we can go over that area a couple of times to reinforce the selection. So we don't need everything to be completely white. But pre-masking is a great tool to allow us to make the correct selections. So I'm going to close these and I'm going to open them up again, but this time in Adobe Camera Raw. So now we've got both of our exposures in Adobe Camera Raw. The great thing about doing this in Adobe Camera Raw and doing matching in Adobe Camera Raw is that we've got full access to the incredible amount of information in our RAW files. And that's the most non-destructive and cleanest way of editing our image, through editing directly on the RAW file. Now with pre-masking, all we're going to do is make the areas that we want to select much brighter. So we've got these windows here. These are highlights in our image. We want the exterior to be brighter or white. There we could just bring up the highlights. And now the windows, the exterior, are completely white. So we've immediately given ourselves a better selection. Now we can, if we want, also bring down our exposure and our shadows so that we've got a more contrasting mask. So our first mask, our Brights 1 mask, will be a black and white representation of what you see here, which means all of the window will be selected and the darker areas won't be. And here's a great thing as well. We looked at matching previously. Well, we can match our darker exposure during the preparation phase. We don't have to open up in Photoshop and then open up Adobe Camera Raw again. We can just bring up the exposure, bring up the shadows, bring down the highlights, and prepare our images for exposure blending. And once we've done that, we select both of our exposures, make sure we've got the settings in lens corrections checked, and just press Open Objects. I'm holding down Shift and Open Objects. Now I'll stack my exposures, and there's the base exposure on the bottom. And you see we've got that beautiful selection of the window now. So if I press Brights 1, I've made the dark exposure invisible. There's a great selection of the window. I can make the mask a little bit more contrasting so it doesn't affect other areas. In fact, no, I'm going to leave that as it is. I'm going to press Select, Hide Marching Ants, create a black mask, show that layer, and a white brush, add 100% opacity, and I'm going to paint in the window. You see, we've made a beautiful selection of that area. And let's do this window as well, just as before. And you'll notice how we don't have to match anything. It's already a very believable scene. The result looks natural. However, of course, let's deselect that active selection and then click on Base, choose Adobe Camera Raw and press Default. So we're putting our base exposure back to 0. And then we bring our highlights down to continue matching. And there we are. There's the final result. And that's what our mask looked like. So we've got a great selection of the exterior without affecting other areas around it. So let me show you a different example of that, where clouds are involved and they're stopping us from making a good selection. So here are two exposures from the very beautiful Glen Orchy. We've got a brighter exposure for the jetty and for the mountains, and we've got a darker exposure here for the information in the sky and the light on the jetty as well. Now let's open these up as they are as smart objects. And I'm actually going to use the Lens Corrections tab and remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. When that's done, we hold down Shift and open up Smart Objects. Now I stack the exposures and make sure the base is on the bottom. And here we're going to try and make a selection of the sky. Shouldn't be too hard, but one of the problems is that we've got these clouds up the top here. And when I bring my bright exposure along, we do make the sky whiter, which is great, but these clouds don't disappear. And we want those to be white because we want to take the clouds from the darker exposure and put them in the image. But the more I bring along this slider, the darker we make the foreground and the more contrasting the image becomes, and the worse the blend will be, which will make a poor transition between the exposures. So I'm going to reset those sliders, and in fact I'm going to delete Instamask, select the brighter exposure, and open up Adobe Camera Raw. Now this image is actually too bright anyway for a base exposure. I want it to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to bring down the exposure just to increase the mood of the image. Then I'm going to bring up the highlights and then the whites slider. Now if you find that the clouds are still visible, you can bring up the exposure again so that they're nice and white and bring down the shadows instead. And so we're creating a really contrasting mask, but not too contrasting. You see, the foreground isn't black, so we should still get a pretty good transition between these exposures. So we've made the sky white, so that'll be easily selected. And this now, the clouds here are more like an upper mid-tone. So we should also make a good selection of that area too. So if we press OK, and I select the darker exposure, I can choose a bright swan, and I can bring along this slider, this highlight slider, and you see we're excluding more of that cloud. And I think that's a pretty good selection. I don't want the foreground to be any darker than it is now. These mountains along here need a smoother transition between these exposures. If I made them all completely black with the sky totally white, it just wouldn't look very natural. So with that done, I'm going to press select, hide the marching ants, put a black mask on the layer, show the layer, choose a white brush, and I'm going to choose a big brush. And now I'm going to paint in the sky from the darker exposure. And we can go over that a couple of times. And of course, the blend doesn't look very natural. And I'm going to do along here as well. And in the water, and I'm going to go over these a few times, just reinforcing the selection there. And we might even go over the jetty as well, just to make it an even blend. Now I'm going to press deselect here. So we've brought through all of the clouds. They look fantastic, but as you can see, the blend looks terrible. The great thing is you should already know how to fix this. So all we need is matching. So if I open Instamask, go to Adobe Camera Raw, I can brighten up this exposure and bring the highlights down significantly. In fact, I think that exposure is a little bit too bright. Bring up the shadows instead. Bring down the exposure. So what I'm trying to do here is brighten up the mountains in the foreground, but keeping the sky dark and moody. So if I'm happy with that, I can press OK. And as you'd imagine, that's created a really beautiful blend. Look at that, before and after. But let's not forget, our base exposure looks crazy right now. So that's one of the main reasons for the initial bad blend. So if we click on our base exposure, open up Adobe Camera Raw and just press default here, and bring along the highlight slider just to create a nice connection between the brighter and darker exposure, and press OK. There we have a more or less flawless blend. Look at the mask that we created. Because we could paint over the sky multiple times with the luminosity masks and reinforce that selection, we have none of the clouds from the brighter exposure coming through. Now, just as I mentioned before, I think the foreground should be a little bit dark, but I actually put it to default so the foreground is quite bright here. But instead of bringing it down in Adobe Camera Raw, which we can do, let's look at one really good reason for why exposure blending is so important. We've already added a clipping mask to a darker exposure before, and it worked beautifully. It allows us to control the areas that come from that exposure. So we know that the sky and the reflection in the water come from the darker exposure. So by clipping a layer to it, any changes that we make affect only the darker exposure. Now that looks a little bit strong, a little bit oversaturated, so I'm going to change the blend mode to luminosity, bring down the opacity a little bit. But we can darken the foreground of this image just by creating a curves layer, and we don't even need to create a clipping mask because it's under the darker exposure. Look, the only thing we're affecting if I bring this all the way down is the foreground. We're not affecting the sky because the foreground comes from the darker exposure. So if we want to create some mood, I can bring down the midtones and bring up the shadows so they're not completely clipped, and that creates a soft, moody contrast feel. So that's before and after. And that's probably a little bit too strong, so I can bring down the opacity of that layer, and there's before and after. Now guys, if you're wondering about the noise in this image, so if we zoom in, you see it's got quite a bit of noise. That's because I shot this at a really high ISO. I needed some quick exposures to do a panorama across the whole scene, and I had no idea how much time I would have for the beautiful colors that you can see in the sunrise here. So quick exposures, 9 brackets, and I just spun all the way around and shot a full almost 180-degree panorama. So that's where the noise comes from. That isn't because we've played with the raw files in Adobe Camera Raw. So now I'm going to show you one more example of pre-masking using a seascape. So here we have 2 exposures. We have a base exposure and a darker exposure. And I want to take, obviously, the sky from the darker exposure and put it into the base exposure. But you see that we've got information in the sky here in the base exposure. So when we try to create the mask, we might not select as much of the sky as we'd like. So if we make the selection, we might find that we come out with a patchy sky. But if we pre-mask, so we try to make the sky quite bright, we'll come out with a good selection. So if I bring the highlights all the way up, see we've almost made the sky completely white. And then I can bring the whites all the way up. And we've made the sky totally white. And I think it's probably a little bit too strong, so I'm going to bring the whites down a tiny bit. And now I'm going to bring the shadows down a bit, because we don't want this rock to be selected or this cliff in the background. So I'm going to bring these shadows down. So that's given us a very good selection of the sky and of some of the water as well. Then I'm going to open up my darker exposure, and I'm going to bring up the exposure of that, bring up the shadows a little bit, and bring down the highlights. So again, we're just matching roughly the brightness values of this base exposure. When we've done that, we hold down Shift, choose the brighter exposure, and then choose Open Objects. And we stack our layers with our dark exposure on top and our base exposure on the bottom. We go to Instamask. We can hide our dark exposure, choose Brights 1, and that should already give us a pretty good selection. But I'm going to bring along the midtones a bit just to exclude more of this water here in the foreground. Then I'm going to press Select, Show Layer, Black Mask, hide the marching ants and choose a white brush, make it a little bit smaller, and then paint the sky and the water in the foreground in. So that already looks quite natural, but of course we need to change the brightness values of the base exposure, because we did all the pre-masking there. So if I choose the base exposure and I double click on the thumbnail or choose Adobe Camera Raw in Instamask, and I press Default and bring down the brightness and then press OK, we come out with a good result. So this is before we removed the pre-masking, and this is after. A very natural blend. And this is our mask here. Now you might be wondering how long all this takes. You don't want to have to open up Adobe Camera Raw many times when you're processing your images, because it makes things a little bit longer. But unfortunately, we can't automate anything in Adobe Camera Raw. Photoshop won't let us. So we have to do these things naturally. Fortunately, all of the matching, as you can see, can be done at the very beginning when we first open our images in Adobe Camera Raw. We can match the dark exposure and we can match the brighter exposure. And most of the time we won't even need a pre-mask. So we can open the base exposure as it is, and then we can blend the exposures, and then the only thing we need to do is open up Adobe Camera Raw on the base exposure and bring down the highlights of the base exposure. And that's it. I think most of the time when I blend exposures, it takes me probably a minute or 2 minutes. Unless it's a really complex scene, and then it might take me a few minutes. The reason why it seems like a longer process here is just because I'm explaining to you each step as we move along so that you understand what we need to do. Now, I highly recommend that you go back through the last video for matching and this video a few times and practice with your own images so you can see how useful these two techniques really are.